Li Yi, a southern tune. I married a Chu Tang trader. Day after day, he breaks his promise to come home. I've always known how regular the tides are. I should have married one who rides them. So, this is the last of the 5-word quatrain Jue Fu, and this is a poem written by Li Yi. We've already encountered Li Yi before. He is a poet that is represented by 3 poems in this anthology. This is the second out of 3. I think it was probably a long time ago, so very brief recap about him. He's basically a mid-Tang poet. He came from the northwest of China, so, he passed the Jinshi examinations and served in a variety of minor posts. You could say his career was moderately successful. He occupied basically middle-ranking posts in the administration. At the beginning of the 9th century, he had some luck in that the fact that his poetry was liked a lot by Tang Xianzong led to his positioning in some important sinecures at the imperial palace, like director of the imperial library and so on. And his last post was as Minister of Rights, I think. He was a protege of the new faction at the beginning of the 9th century. So, pretty middling career. Not extremely famous as a poet. In fact, his greatest reputation, and one that ironically rhymes with the poem that we've read today, is as a bad husband. He had a reputation of being an uncaring, unfeeling, and cruel husband. In fact, some Tang dynasty fictional tales, I think late Tang, or maybe from the Sung, included him as the protagonist and as the archetype of the bad husband. And in the poem we have today, we have indirectly a bad husband. So this poem, again, like the poems in its section, is based on Jue Fu poetry. The title of this poem is a southern tune. The original is like a Jiangnan song, Jiangnan, south of the Jiang, south of the Jiang River, or in the area. And the topic of the poem, as you have seen, this poem is in the voice of a female poetic persona. It's a wife's lament. We've encountered some poems like this also in the Jue Fu style, like Li Bai's Chang'an song. So, and there are many others. So, women's complaints are a very typical genre in Chinese poetry, almost from the beginnings. You already have them in the Xi Jing, for example. Generally, most of these women's laments or most of these wives' complaints are focused in the following way. Their husbands are either soldiers that are serving in the frontier, or as in this case, they are merchants. And merchants had to roam around the world of China, selling and buying. And they are frequently absent from home for long periods of time. So the poem here, as I said, the topic would be a wife's lament, a wife's complaint. I don't know how seriously or how literally to take it, but the gist of it is that, she married this rich trader. Well, maybe not necessarily rich, but she married this trader who has not kept his promises to her and who keeps going to and fro and never coming home and probably enjoying good company and pleasure far from his wife, who must live alone and sad at home. And she laments and says, it would have been better for me maybe to marry one of these poorer persons, one of these people who work here riding the tide next to the river, like people who work in the nearbouts pulling boats or conducting them or fishing, doing these kind of cheap and low paid and low social status jobs. But it would have been better for me to do that because at least I would have been able to see my husband almost every day. The poem, like most of the Jue Fu-inspired poems, apparently is pretty simple in diction and in message in the original, although it does make in the second couplet some wordplay which I imagine has been very difficult to translate, about, using expressions about the waves coming and going, the regularity of the tides, riding the waves, this sort of using the waves as metaphors for different things. So let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet as usual. First couplet. I married a Chu Tang trader. Day after day, he breaks his promise to come home. So as usual, the first couplet sets the background and really tells us all the story. that is to be told. Her husband is a Chutang trader. Chutang is one of the three gorges of the Yangtze River, I think located quite to the west of China, almost nearing the area of modern-day Sichuan, ancient Shu, and Tibet. So we might imagine that he would have been a trader going up and down the Yangtze River, which was a navigable river for most of its parts, and perhaps even further on. And she married him, and now he doesn't come home day after day. He has broken his promise, so he's an unfaithful husband, probably in more than one sense. Probably not just in not keeping his promises. I imagine he probably enjoys other female company during his travels. Okay, second couplet. I've always known how regular the tides are. I should have married one who rides them. So, in the second couplet, the woman continues speaking and voices her complaint through the metaphor of the water. So water, waves, this sort of imagery of water imagery permeates the poem. The husband is a Chutang trader who is going up and down the river, and in the second couplet, she uses images of water and of tides, especially, to illuminate her unsatisfactory condition. So I've always known how regular the tides are. As you know, the tides follow their fixed periods, and maybe she's always known that because she's always lived next to rivers. And she's making the comparison here between the stability of the tides and the contrast rather between the stability of the tides and the instability of her husband's affection and her husband's presence. So remember, Chinese poetry generally has a great recourse to nature. Nature in most Chinese poems is not just a background, it's meant to be a mirror of human emotions, and sometimes the emotions aren't stated because just certain natural settings and seasonal settings already indicate for the reader, who is acquainted with this style, the feeling that the poem is transmitting. So here you could say that the waves and the regularity of the tides is opposite to the irregularity of the husband. This sometimes happens a lot in Chinese poetry. It's not just nature echoing or reaffirming the feelings of the poet, whether these feelings be sad or happy. Sometimes there is a contrast, which is a source of indignation for the poetic voice, usually. This is very typical in love poems, like a woman lamenting in spring that her lover is away. So spring, which is the period of universal love and renewal and fertility, is with the trees blossoming and the leaves shiny and green. Spring is felt as doubly insulting by the abandoned woman who cannot live her spring and who, unlike spring, will not repeat the cycle. As she is getting older, humans are linear and nature is cyclical. But anyway, here the regularity of the tides is used as a symbol, and not only as a symbol, because she says something like, I've always known how regular the tides are, and I should have married someone like the tides. So she has someone who rides them, by which she could mean somebody who works, with the tides, but is not a faraway Chutang merchant. So, as I said, maybe a fisherman or a worker, a sailor worker in some boats in the river, perhaps in the Jiangsu. Remember the topic there. This is a southern tune, Jiangnan, south of the river, so it's located in that area. The aquatic area of what had been the kingdom of Chu was an area where many people lived and communicated through the river, and didn't necessarily have to go that far away for making a living. So she wishes a stable husband like the tides, and she wished she had married one of these who live on the tides and by the tides, but not necessarily going as far away as her husband. And that's it. I think the poem really doesn't have anything else to comment. So, a woman's lament, and perhaps the difference between many other woman's laments that we've read here is that this is not in the style of the Jade Terrace poems. This is not a concubine or an imperial wife languishing in luxurious quarters. There's no indication of material prosperity for the speaker of the poem, although we might imagine the wife of a prosperous merchant would have led a relatively decent lifestyle.